This was decided already before the explosion took place. So that means that the Americans knew exactly what's going to happen. I've never seen anything like that before, because you had the US president standing there saying that we will destroy your energy security and you will get into real trouble. And Olaf Scholz was standing there beside him and saying that we are working closely with the Americans.
What do we really know about the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipelines?
Gegen den Strom. Zur Person.
Hello, welcome to Against the Current. We present viewpoints and different perspectives which the mainstream propaganda media are deliberately suppressing. It was on the 26th of September in the year 2022 that the Baltic Sea pipelines, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, were deliberately blown up. With that, the energy trap snapped shut for Germany. The experienced journalist and investigator Seymour Hersh from the United States is accusing his very own government, the government of the United States. In Europe, Professor Ola Tunander from the Peace Research Institute in Oslo has, more comprehensively than anyone else, undertaken a renewed investigation of this particular case. And today, we will be discussing the reliability and credibility of Seymour Hersh's findings and what additional information we have uncovered in the interim.
Welcome, Ola Tunander. It's a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much.
What did you find out? What do we really know about the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipelines?
We know what happened during these days, and we know what happened before, the history. And you could say, when it comes to the history, we know that from 1981, the Reagan administration was very upset about the gas pipelines. It was a gas pipeline between Soviet Union at the time and Germany, West Germany. And the people like CIA Director Casey, Secretary of Defense Weinberger, and National Security Advisor Dick Allen were strongly against the pipelines and wanted to stop it. And according to Dick Allen and his deputy, Tom Reed, they actually succeeded in detonating an explosion against the pipeline in 1982. So, but the Germans and the Russians or the Soviets, they continued the process, and the pipeline became the very foundation for the dialogue between Europe and Soviet Union, between Gorbachev and the Germans, and it became a very important foundation for the end of the Cold War. The Cold War, because it created a trust between the Europeans and the Russians. So this was most important, I think, for the end of the Cold War and also for the success of the talks between Gorbachev and President Reagan in the late 80s. So this is the background for the role of the pipelines. The pipelines had the same role as, you could say, the coal and steel community after the Second World War that then led up to the European Union. So actually, this was a foundation for a real change of policy. And certain part of the American security elite was against it all the time. So, for example, Dick Cheney, who was the Secretary of Defense around 1990, during the George H.W. Bush presidency, he was against these pipelines strongly, and he wanted actually to destroy Soviet Union, not just Soviet Union, but also Russia. Russia should be made into small pieces, so to speak. And after 2000, when the discussion of the Nord Stream pipeline started, Dick Cheney was strongly against the pipeline. And that was also the case with his strong, loyal, later Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland. Nuland was a pupil of Cheney. And also what was important person was Scowcroft, who was a national security advisor for George H.W. Bush. And his supporter was Condoleezza Rice, who became later Secretary of State, and so on. And these two people played an important role after 2000, when Condoleezza Rice said in 2014, told German TV that Germany has to change its energy dependency from Russia to United States. And United States has very good gas possibilities. And this LNG, which was of course much more costly than the Russian gas, but she said that it's time for Germany now to change. And of course, this would not be possible to change without blowing up the pipeline. You couldn't ask Germany to change its energy dependency and get something much more expensive. So actually from 2014, you could say that the Americans had decided to take out the pipeline. And you had from these years, from 2016, they started with a massive production of LNG, which would be the necessary replacement of the Russian gas for Germany. And 2018-19, they had a lot of talks about taking out the pipeline. And for example, National Security Advisor John Bolton, who was working under Condoleezza Rice before, he became National Security Advisor under Trump. And he said Trump had the pipeline on the table. But he couldn't decide, Bolton said. He should have cut it off already at that time, 2019. So he couldn't decide, and that is not untypical for Trump, Bolton said. But actually later, Trump said, just last year, he said that it was not Biden who decided to take out the pipeline. I did it. I decided. Biden just approved my decision. So according to Trump, he actually took decision after John Bolton had ended his position as a national security advisor. So it must, in 2020 sometime, maybe late 2020, Trump took the decision. And then Biden said in February 2022 that if Russia enters Ukraine, there won't be any Nord Stream pipeline any longer. And that's true. That's what happened. And we know, so from the background, you could say we know that the Americans had been discussing and preparing for taking out the pipeline from 1980s, and the Nord Stream pipeline from early 2000 when it started the building of the pipeline. And that is a fact.
That means the interruption, the destroying of the energy partnership between Russia and Germany was a long-term geostrategic goal of the United States.
Yes. So it's very clear that, and you could say, the strength of United States is, to some extent economical, but the most important has always been the security guarantees and security support from United States. And if you don't perceive Russia as an enemy, then you lose all its influence in Europe. United States would become a normal country. And that was unacceptable for the Americans. They wanted to have a special influence in Europe. And by cutting the pipeline, they got that. And you destroyed the possibility of the peace that was opened up after the Cold War. So in the 1990s, many people believed in a possible peaceful development in Europe and in relation to Soviet Union and United States, Soviet Union and later Russia. But there were important power elite in United States and also some in Europe that wanted to cut off this kind of relationship, and they did.
The first Secretary General of NATO, Lord Ismay, said NATO was found to keep the Americans in, to keep the Germans down, and to keep the Russians out, the Soviet Union out. And so the blowing up of the pipeline could be part of this strategy.
Yeah, true. It is. So you could say it's definitely the case that if you look at what happened in the end of the Cold War, that Dick Cheney and Scowcroft, they wanted to expand NATO, and Baker said that okay, but we couldn't tell the Russians, and Bush also actually said this in these terms. So Baker said we promised not to extend NATO, but when he went back to Scowcroft and Cheney, he said the opposite. And that, of course, became a problem. And you had this elite, the power elite around Cheney, that were very important in the 90s or after 2000. And they have decided that they had to take out the pipeline. And so this is you could say, historical background, and you have the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Congress that says, we have to take out the pipeline. And this was in 2019. So it's in general, there were very important part of the security establishment in United States that wanted to take out the pipeline. Then we could come to the fact that actually happens the very days when it was taken out. And I studied the use of the Poseidon aircraft, the American Poseidon aircraft, that were an aircraft used for maritime surveillance to find submarines under the surface. And there were one station on Keflavik, Iceland, and another in the Mediterranean at Sigonella, Italy. And the Poseidon flights from Sigonella went around Mediterranean to find out about submarine activity in the Mediterranean. And the flights from Keflavik went in the North Atlantic area, in the Norwegian Sea, and in the north, also up to the Barents and so on, and around Greenland. But in certain occasions, they went into the Baltic. And that was from the Sigonella aircraft in the Mediterranean, on Sicily. They went up on twice, and that was during the Baltops exercise in June 2022 in the Baltic Sea. It was Baltops is a yearly exercise that you had in the Baltic Sea, and this airplane went up to Cuxhaven, to Nordholz air station, naval air station outside Cuxhaven, and it operated back and forth from Nordholz over the Baltic Sea during this week and during the Baltops exercise. And it was a plane coming down from Keflavik, Iceland, and every day during the Baltops exercise, and went over the South Baltic Sea area, east of Bornholm, where you had the exercise. And the exercise was about mining the sea mines, and it included diving on the surface area. And the problem was, when it comes to these events, after the Baltops exercise in June, these airplanes coming in from Sigonella, Italy, and from Keflavik, Iceland, went down during the days around the destruction of the pipeline. So they went out one flight to Nordholz and went 23rd to 25th, the days before. The 26th was the explosion. So 23rd to 25th, this aircraft went over the Bornholm Islands back and forth during the night. And if you mentioned the Seymour Hersh article, and he argued that one should use a Poseidon aircraft for dropping a sonar buoy that would send a coded signal to the explosives, and to the timers actually for the explosives. That he argued that this is what happened, and he thought then that the Norwegian Poseidon aircraft would have done that, because that was kind of pre-planning. But actually the Norwegian Poseidon aircraft were not ready for it. So they had to go up with an American aircraft from Mediterranean up to do that. And then on the very day or night when the explosion took place, a Poseidon aircraft from Keflavik, Iceland, went down to the Baltic Sea, and it went passing the South Norway at the very moment of the explosion, and arrived to the place of the explosion 1 hour later. So it started 2 hours before the explosion from Keflavik. It went down to the place of the explosion and came there 1 hour later. It then was refueled at over Poland by this was air refueling. So it was a tanker aircraft coming up from Spangdahlem air base close to Luxembourg in Germany, up to and meeting the Poseidon aircraft, and the tanker aircraft left in the very minute where the explosion took place, and then went up to Poland and then meeting the Poseidon aircraft and refueled it for 1 hour or a little bit more, I think. And then the tanker aircraft went back to Spangdahlem, and then the Poseidon aircraft went up over the southern Baltic Sea, east of Bornholm, in the area of the explosion, and then patrolled this area for 4 hours, and then went back to Keflavik. And that means a couple of things. Firstly, that when it went back, it came to the place, the position of the explosion at a low altitude, and immediately afterwards it climbed to 10,000 meters. So it means that its interest was certainly the explosion, and it patrolled the area of the explosion and the area closer to Russia, to the Baltijsk, the Russian naval base Baltijsk. So it certainly was interested in if there was any Russian submarine going out that you could put the blame on, for example. But you could say for sure it wasn't, because if it had been, we had known that at this time. And secondly, you could say that the planning for this patrolling of the place of the explosion was made long before the explosion, because the aircraft left 2 hours before, and you have some pre-planning when you leave you have an aircraft leaving. It's not decided in the very minute it happens, so to speak. And the same goes for the tanker aircraft. And the only possibility for the Poseidon aircraft to operate for 4 hours over the area of the explosion in southern Baltic Sea would be that you had refueling of the aircraft, because the aircraft could have easily gone from Keflavik to southern Baltic and back without refueling. But because it was going to patrol the area for several hours, then it has to be refueled. And this was decided already before the explosion took place. So that means that the Americans knew exactly what's going to happen. And they did not inform the Germans, or as we know at least, and they did not inform the Russians, which means that they are directly part of the operation. And you could say almost certainly they are also controlling the whole operation.
As far as I can understand, that means both Poseidons, both aircrafts, were monitoring the situation, and one Poseidon aircraft placed the buoy to signal the bomb. Is that right?
You have the sonar buoys that are dropped from a Poseidon aircraft have a parachute So they go down with not too fast, so it should be made any problem when it hits the surface. So it's and if you go back to what Seymour Hersh wrote in his article, which was detailed on this specific point, was that you had a coded signal that could trigger the timers of the bombs, and that is a efficient way to do it, because you don't have to pass any borders and so on. You just fly over. The problem was if these sonar buoys with the coded signals, if they were supposed to be dropped by Norwegian Poseidon aircraft, they would be in Norway at the time. And what you find was that a Hercules aircraft from Sigonella, Italy, went up to Andøya Air Base in far north of Norway a few days before, and then back. So it fetched something at the Andøya Air Base. And Andøya Air Base is very close to Evenes, where you have the Norwegian Poseidon aircraft. And because the Evenes is not, or were not developed properly at the time, so if you would have some important instruments or so on, they would be stored at Andøya Air Base. So what happened was that the Hercules aircraft went up to Andøya and fetched something, and that was done. And at the same time, it came in a Poseidon aircraft from Keflavik, most likely with a senior officer to just handle the situation. And then the Hercules aircraft went back to Sigonella. So that would mean that the sonar buoys that were supposed to use to trigger the explosives, or trigger the timers rather, for the explosives, were very likely fetched at that moment. So you got them in Sigonella. And so I think, you couldn't prove that the Poseidon aircraft dropped sonar buoys when it went from Nordholz Air Base Cuxhaven over Bornholm and then back. But you could say it's very likely. And why? What did they do that? I mean, it was not an exercise. It was an operation. It was done during the night. And if you look at the Flight Radar 24 and some other of these flight radar websites, you find that is almost no military aircraft up during the night. And these military aircraft have a operational role. So you could say it was an operation that was carried out from Nordholz Airport, or Naval Air Station is called, I think, or Air Base. So it was and the same you could say with the Keflavik plane on the 26th of September. It left at 12 o'clock in the night, and arrived 3 hours later at Bornholm, just east of Bornholm, where the explosion took place 1 hour before this plane arrived. So it's I think it's no doubt that this is the case. You could then argue that there was it was a small Ukrainian sailing boat or a small sailing boat with a 6 men or 5 men, 1 woman, I guess, crew going out from Germany and then up to, and this has been written very much in German media, I guess, Der Spiegel and Zeit and so on, and they probably did something, and they had a Ukraine flag on the sailing boat. They visited all the harbors on Rügen and up Bornholm and South Sweden and so on. So they were very active, showing off, and they claim that they have been diving, and they could have done that. They could have been diving, but you also had, at the same time, you have the 3 American large naval ships in exactly the same area. On the 21st of September, the days before the explosions, you had the Kearsarge, which was a 250 meters small aircraft carrier, at the very positions at the explosions, and the rescue vessel from the Christiansö, also a small island northeast of Bornholm, they realized that it was a couple of ships there, and they didn't respond to radio, and the EIS signals were turned off. So they went up there and see what kind of ships is there that behave in this way, and it turned out that it was huge U.S. naval ships, and they were there actually to do something. And then the days after, they left the Baltic Sea, and that was if you think it's some Ukraine sailor, or do you think it's a U.S. naval ship? Maybe both had something to do with it, but it's I think that the capability of the U.S. ships is enormous, and they of course could have a small submarine operating.
Is it physically possible that 2 or 3 divers from a sailing yacht are going down and to place the explosives?
It's some very well trained divers, and one could of course imagine that what they claim,
it is a depth of 80 meters.
They could go down to 80 meters, but why did they go to 80 meters when they could place these explosives? Most of the area where you have this pipeline, it's 30 to 40 meters or 50 meters. So why would you do it in the so-called Bornholm Basin, where it is deep water? Why do you go do that? I mean, it doesn't make sense. So it's really done at a place where you make it difficult for yourself. technically it's possible, but it's unlikely that this was the major actor in this case. And there are also some people argue. There was a Ukraine politician now living in Belarus, I think, called Andrei Derkash, who claimed that they had recruited people, the Americans, the head of CIA in Kiev, had recruited people, which was specialist divers, actually, to do, and they had been training also at the pipeline in Romania, in the Black Sea. So it means that they needed some kind of cover. They needed a plausible deniability. They have to put the blame on someone, and that is what U.S. military forces and the CIA and so on always try to do. So because you should not have to put the blame on yourself, so you let someone else supposedly do something, and that was also the case with the Norwegians. They wanted to have Norwegians to do it. They could have done it very well themselves, but they preferred to have Norwegians doing it because then you could put the blame on the Norwegians, and the Norwegians, of course, had you could say, an interest, because they were, for them, it was, the Russian-German pipeline was a competitor compared to the Norwegian pipelines. And Norwegian's pipelines had an important role for Germany, and now, and also for rest of Europe, for Central Europe. And but what happened in the September 2022 was that they were going to open up a new huge pipeline from Norway, from the Norwegian gas fields to Poland. And this pipeline was supposed to be or it was inaugurated on the 27th of September, the day after the Nord Stream pipeline were taken out. So actually, the Baltic pipe, as it was called, that was a Norwegian, Danish, Polish pipeline. They went over from the Norwegian gas fields over Denmark and then to Poland. And this pipeline was supposed to replace the Nord Stream pipeline when it comes to capacity and so on. So it means the day before the inauguration of this pipeline, someone took out the Russian-German pipeline. And the problem for the Norway was, of course, that if you have an inauguration the day after you destroy your major competitor, this looks very bad. So what happened was that the Norwegian Prime Minister didn't participate at the inauguration in Szczecin, I think, yes. And so it was the Polish president, the Polish Prime Minister, and the Danish Prime Minister who participated in the inauguration. And the Norwegian Prime Minister cancelled his participation 5 days before. And you could imagine then it's something very important. But He was looking at some figures in the budget that very day. So it was nothing happening, so to speak, and he was, and this was an inauguration of it was a most important inauguration that year, or in several years, and he didn't go because he couldn't go, because that would have been a celebration of the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. So that means that 5 days before, or 6 days before, or 7 days before, he would have been informed that the explosion would take place. And so then you had to think, where was he? I mean, he had the 20th of September, 7 days before, he had the Prime Minister's office announced in all newspapers that he was going to Poland for the inauguration of the pipeline. But then he went to United States and was, at this very time, he was briefed for 1 day's briefing almost by the U.S. Secretary of the Navy at the naval station in Norfolk outside Washington. And he was also briefed on the aircraft carrier Gerald Ford. And then he went to New York, to the UN, and met Secretary Blinken, and then went back on the 22nd to Norway, or 22nd, 23rd. So it means that he actually cancelled this visit to the inauguration because of what he was informed about in the United States.
So I think this was an attack on Russian-German infrastructure and on the energy link between both states. And at the same time, they created a new European and American Western integrated energy infrastructure.
Yes.
And how did they place the explosives at the pipelines?
That I don't know. I mean, it's the argument from Seymour Hersh is that they did it during the Baltops exercise in June, that they did it already in the Baltops exercise in June, and that they had timers on the explosives that were would be triggered, as I told before, triggered by these coded signals. And according to Seymour Hersh, they used deep diving, U.S. Navy deep divers from Panama City, Florida. And this, there was a statement by a German journalist Thomas Röper, claiming that it was one diving coordinator a diving coordinator at the exercise that were surprised that some divers came with deep diving capability, with a lot of instruments necessary for deep diving and not for mine exercise. And they were away for quite some time also. So he worried about he even informed the leadership that they had disappeared. Like, he didn't get contact with them. So that the interesting thing here is that Seymour Hersh claimed that they were coming from Panama City, Florida, and they were actually leaving the Ronneby air base in Sweden, which was used as air base for the Baltops exercise. There were American planes going to Rota, Spain, the naval station, the U.S. naval station in southwestern Spain, and then went to Norfolk Naval Station at Washington, and then down to Panama City, Florida. So they were definite divers from Panama City, Florida, at the Baltops exercise. So you could say this has been confirmed without Seymour Hersh knowing about it.
And these divers were special forces, U.S. special forces.
I think they were not, but they were diving specialists, and so they were used, and they were used for deep diving operations, and they were. If you look at the planes that went back to Panama City, Florida, you could imagine that these were also for these deep divers, and they would supposedly had placed the explosives on the pipelines short at the very end of the exercise, and they had also supposedly met the admiral, the top leaders at the exercise, and also there were civilians coming in, meeting them, which would be intelligence operatives.
Thomas Röper, the journalist, had a source on a ship, on a NATO ship. And now he was sanctioned by the EU. Is there a link between that? Was Thomas Röper sanctioned because he knew too much? He had a source on the ground and he became dangerous?
I don't know, but at least you could say that this has not been presented in the usual media. So it is so for some reason they didn't trust that source, if you want, and of course this source did not, put it this way, this source did not say what they wanted them to say. It's very clear that you had this deep diving people coming up, and that fits very well with what this source had told. So I think it's very likely.
We have a situation, and this is very interesting, according to that what you said, that parallel to the special operation, the cover-up is starting. Is this right, for plausible deniability?
Yeah, it's. I don't know if it started before, but at least it's certainly started at this time, and you have. When you do a special operation like this one, you have to have plausible deniability, and that means that if you, for example, had placed explosives on the pipeline during the Baltops exercise, and then the pipelines would explode a week after, people would say, aha, it was placed during the Baltops exercise. It was obvious. because they were just above the pipeline and they had divers. So who should else have done it? So you had to postpone the triggering of the explosives, and that you could do a couple of months and so on. The problem, I think, was that people in Germany had been a bit upset about the gas situation in August, September in 2022, and also I think in Czechoslovakia. And the Russian President Vladimir Putin had said that, so why, if you are unhappy with the situation, why don't you open up Nord Stream 2, which had been closed actually. The Nord Stream 1 functioned, but Nord Stream 2 was not open up yet. And then it's very possible that the Americans would say, we couldn't wait for that. So we have to do something now. And that could be a reason for why they triggered the explosives at the very time that when they did it.
You explained how Norwegian politicians were involved in some way. Could you explain how, for example, Chancellor Olaf Scholz was involved? He stood beside of US President Joe Biden. Biden declared, we will finish up the pipeline, and Olaf Scholz is grinning into the cameras. What do you feel about that?
I thought it was pretty strange. I thought I've never seen anything like that before, and because you had a president, a U.S. president, standing there saying that we will destroy your energy security, and you will get into real trouble, and Olaf Scholz was standing there beside him and saying that we are working closely with the Americans. So it was pretty strange, I would say. I think when it comes to the Norwegians, I'm not sure what the Norwegian political leadership knew from the beginning. And the impression is that it was some people, or a couple of people, whatever, in the Norwegian intelligence and navy who were involved, and then that they backed out, actually. Maybe they were involved in some way when it comes to some ships during the Baltops exercise, because they had a ship with a decompression chamber, or had a couple of ships with decompression chambers, but you had at least one where they put a decompression chamber afterwards on the ship, and it was used for divers or American divers and so on. So it may very well be that they participated, but I could easily imagine that political leadership was not too happy about it, and actually tried to back out. And when it comes to the Poseidon aircraft, they could say that they were not ready for an operation. They had been training with a aircraft, but the whole thing was postponed several months. So they started the training with them in June 2022, and that was not enough for having an operation in September. So I think that the Norwegian political leadership was happy with this postponement, and I think that they knew from their, in the strategic community in Norway, there was a tradition still that you should have not have a really conflict with Russia. You had tried to have a détente policy. You tried to have a base policy and a nuclear policy that would not provoke the Russians. That was already from 1949. So so this is a change of policy, and to really attack Russia with a Russian pipeline, that would of course be, could lead to a war. So I mean, you could say that one have to be surprised that the Russians had not done more than they did. So it's, but that's, I mean, the Russians know most likely more or less what happened, because they follow, of course, everything, and it's unlikely that, I mean, they had said several times that it's the Anglo-Americans, I mean the British and Americans, who were deeply involved, and maybe there were some Ukrainians, but that is not the major issue, I think.
That leads us to the role of the Brits. Did you find any evidence of an involvement of British Secret Services or British Navy?
During the Baltops exercise, there were also British ships present, but I have there are some people who have written quite a lot about British involvement, but I have not seen anything that is really evidence for the British involvement. On the other hand, I had a talk with a U.S. Admiral and Deputy CIA Bobby Inman, who said that the British, during his time, the British were responsible for the Baltic Sea when it comes to intelligence matters. And that was not the whole truth, I would say. When it comes to Americans played a certain role also. But when it comes to stay-behinds during the Cold War, for example, British submarines deploying special forces along the Swedish coast and so on was part of what happened. And Britain was certainly very deeply involved in activity, the submarine activity in the Baltic Sea. So it's the British submarine, conventional submarines went submerged through the Danish Straits, although this was not legal. So it's the British played a very important role in the Baltic Sea in general, and that would surprise me very much if they were not well informed about what happened. But I have no physical evidence, so to speak. When it comes to Britain had Poseidon aircraft also stationed at a base in northern Scotland, and they could have operated in the Baltic Sea easier than the flight from Keflavik, but they didn't. It was no British Poseidon aircraft in the area, neither when it comes to the Baltops exercise, nor when it comes to the days around the explosion.
How do you judge the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines? Was this a case of state terrorism?
Yes, I mean, as long as you say that US and Britain is not in a direct war against Russia. And if you argue that, and that is the reason you could say nowadays that when it comes to the insurance case, that the Nord Stream company claim that it is a question of terrorism, state terrorism, while the insurance company says it's a question of war, because they claim that it's the Ukraine group that has been responsible.
And in the case of war, they don't have to pay.
In case of war, they don't have to pay. But in case of terrorism, they have to pay. So this is and of course, I would say it's a question of state terrorism. If you then say that it's not, that the US and Britain is not at war with Russia. And that was the general opinion in the United States, at least in 2022, when this happened.
Thank you very much. It was an interesting conversation with you.
Professor Ola Tunander has stated quite clearly that the devastating attack which occurred on the Nord Stream pipelines was certainly not just some kind of mischievous prank carried out by a small Ukrainian group operating from a single sailboat, but instead it constituted a deliberate act of state-sponsored terrorism. Here at Against the Current, we will present to you viewpoints and perspectives that the mainstream propaganda media deliberately choose to conceal.